into Apache or you break into the IIS user, now you're, well, not that Apache's ever had any vulnerabilities, ever. Right, so you break in and you become, you know, the Apache user, and let's say they allow a login on the system because that's how they restart it or something. Well, now, even if it's outside of the web directory, you can read the connection string. So now you have the database username and password.
That's assuming that the application is implemented at the presentation tier, not at the application tier.
Correct. That is assuming that the application is connected to the database at the application tier, not the presentation layer, not the application layer. And when you have things like Tomcat and whatnot, you're absolutely right. You know, you have app servers. Now they also have their own vulnerabilities. So again, I mean, somewhere, right, the connection information is stored. Otherwise, how does one server talk to another? You know, it's kind of like, you know, SSH keys, right? Theoretically, if somebody breaks into one box and there's SSH keys in another box, well, now they can log in. So if somebody breaks into one, you know, if server A has access to database B, and you break into server A, well, now you have access to database B. Right, exactly, which is why you should be implementing it in middle tier. But if you break into the middle tier, then you can still do it. And again, I'm not saying don't implement it in the middle tier. I'm just saying implementing it in the middle tier is better than implementing it in the presentation layer. However, that doesn't mean you should go home and sleep well at night. You know, you should never sleep well at night because your data will be eaten. And that's one of the problems that I have with everyone, with DBAs like myself. It's like, well, you know, it's secure. Well, how secure is it? So here's Postgres. It's got fewer things, but again, groups, you've got roles, so that's easier for authentication. You know, maybe something using, MySQL doesn't have roles, but SQL Server, Postgres, Oracle have roles, so that might be something where you can create 1,000 users and give them these roles and say, okay, you can see this. Did you have a question?
Yeah, you described a universe where you have basically a free-for-all between different groups that have responsibility, typical distributed responsibility and accountability. Is there any place that is developing standards for governance of this kind of stuff, as opposed to focusing it on a technical level and looking at, you know, maybe focus, but another place to look is governance.
Okay, so the question is, are there people working on standards of governance of this whole universe of security, from, you know, the network to the operating system to the database to the middle tier to the presentation layer? You know, are there any organizations? I haven't looked into it. I haven't heard of any, but I haven't really researched it. But that, I mean, that's pretty much what my presentation is, right? Is for you guys to go and like develop your policies at your institution, you know, using the ones you already have. It's hard to do because there are so many groups. And if it's all one department, they probably don't have time to do this stuff. So it's a difficult problem, but it is one we need to solve. And, you know, the problem is that you need, the more access to things we have, the more access to things we demand, and the easier, you know, we have, the easier we want. I mean, hey, I think OpenID is a great thing. It also kind of scares me. Because think about it. Now, instead of having separate passwords for everything, you have like one login in the server. And yeah, you have to trust the server, but one day that might be compromised. You know, it's, how is OpenID different from like a governmental ID system? Well, I trust non-governmental organizations more, so long as they're making money. It's hard. It's really hard. And there's no one perfect solution. If there was, I'd give it and the talk would be over. And I wouldn't have any schmoobles. Anyone else want to throw a schmooble at me? That was actually kind of not too bad. I live to tell. All right. SQL Server, you can actually specify a one-way hash or a two-way hash. Isn't that wonderful? I don't know why they developed it that way. But if you really want a reversible hash in SQL Server for your password, you can have one. Super. All right. And again, without login is actually, oh, let me look at my notes because I don't want to get that wrong. Without login, oh, it connects to other databases as a guest. So you can actually log into other databases, other realms, if you want to think about it that way, as a guest, which doesn't have any connect, by default, guest doesn't have any connect privileges, so you're not really giving any permissions. But you have to be careful when you do say, well, I want the guest to be able to read all the tables in this database, You have to realize that every single other user might be able to do that if they get without login. Anyway, this is just kind of to illustrate how there's different permissions for different things. There's different things you can create. You might not realize, for instance, that in like MySQL, you actually, like with option, some of the options are things like max connections per hour, max queries per hour, max updates per hour. So you can actually specify that kind of access control, not just this user from this host, but you can actually characterize, you know, that data somewhat. But again, you know, if you have a runaway application that is runaway because of bad code, how do you know if it's bad code that was, you know, oops, the developer screwed up, or bad code that's, oops, you know, somebody malicious got into the system? So other ACLs, object access, we talked about, connections, databases, tables, columns, whether or not they can look at the columns or change the columns, whether or not they can look at the data, change the data, whether or not they can execute stored procedures. And stored procedures in general, yes. Sorry, man. The other talks that I'm competing with are online, so I hope you can get something out of them. You know, it's that's the way it goes. I can't please everyone all the time. Oh, password. So password policies. Some SQL Server and Oracle, you can actually specify the constraints on the passwords themselves, including password expiry. MySQL, you can't. You can give the grant option to others. So you can say, okay, whatever permissions you have, you can give to others. Some of the password policies in Oracle are, besides the password verifying function, are failed login attempts, password lifetime, password reuse time, how many times you can reuse one in a row, the password lock time, and how much grace time you have during that lock period. In SQL Server, you can use Kerberos authentication or NTLM authentication. You can actually specify a minimum password age. This is a very Microsoft thing, so that, you know, I can't change my password 3 times in a row to say, okay, my password is A, now I'm going to change it to B, now I'm going to change it to C, now I'm going to change it back to A, so that somebody can't just use the same password over and over. MySQL. Microsoft does that in their operating system too. And you have roles as well, as I was talking about. In SQL Server and Oracle, you have sysdba is a root role for Oracle, and for SQL Server it's called security admin. There's a root user in MySQL that starts out with the default privileges of super, but you can delete that, it doesn't matter. There's nothing special about somebody who has lots of powers in MySQL. It's just whatever, as long as you give them the powers, it doesn't matter what name they have. Whereas because of the roles and the groups, Oracle and SQL Server start out with these roles and groups. So let's see. Who and where? A lot of the usernames are actually user at host. Actually, that was a good place to break if anyone had any more balls they want to throw at me. Anyone else want to leave? I understand it's not very technical, and I lied to you in the description, so feel free, really.
So is all this messing with policies and everything set and unset and clear for its user columns on it? Is that causing vulnerability within MySQL, or is it caused by?
So the question is the access control mess that I'm showing you right now, is that the cause or the symptom of database security? The answer is kind of yes. I mean, this is only just one part of it, right? Well, I mean, is user authentication on an operating system the cause or the symptom of how hard it is to log into a system? It's just one of the... I'm not that bad, am I?